So, good afternoon. I'm Paul Fallon, and welcome to today's webinar on creative workspace and its role in local regeneration. I've been having a look through the registrations, and we've got over 110 people registered to join us this afternoon, and they're from local and regional government and some other arts agencies right across the country. So, we're delighted to have you all with us. And whether you're already delivering on this agenda, exploring new possibilities, or just generally interested in this subject, we're very pleased to have you. In 15 minutes or so, we'll begin meeting people from 3 different locations in England who've been walking the talk about the value of creative workspace. I'm at the moment sitting in East Street Arts' Patrick's Studios in Leeds, which is home to a wide range of artists and makers. I'll be giving you a quick overview of the landscape of creative workspace and then introducing a selection of speakers, thanks to whom for coming along and joining us this afternoon. So why does this subject matter now? Well, I guess across England, councils are facing growing pressure to do more with less, whilst trying to keep places vibrant, inclusive, and economically resilient. We believe that one part of the answer lies in creative workspace, and more specifically, in maker-friendly workspace, which we'll come to in a moment. As we'll be hearing from our speakers, modest interventions can trigger major impacts, changing the mood, the mix, and ultimately the trajectory of entire neighborhoods. Let's begin with some acknowledgements before sharing a bit of context. East Street Arts have organised this afternoon's webinar and are helping to lead this work nationally, both as practitioners and as a sector support organisation. And we'll be hearing from co-founders John and Karen shortly. After that, we'll be speaking to people from Hull, Luton and Middlesbrough, who will be joining us in discussion one at a time, and afterwards coming together as a panel to field your questions. But first, some thanks to Arts Council England, and particularly to Peter Heslip, Director of Visual Arts, for supporting this event through the Creative Workspace Network. Hello, Peter. Will you help to set the context from Arts Council's perspective?
Thanks, Paul. Hello, everybody. I'm Peter Heslip, as Paul says, and it's been really exciting for us to see so much take up today for this event. And I think Paul, as you say, it does speak to the timeliness of this agenda. For us, it's a really exciting moment with the government, which is laser focused on economic growth and which absolutely sees the creative industries as part of the country's future growth. We are speaking directly to ministers at the moment about opportunities to better support our sector in a lot of different ways. So that's central government. But secondly, it's also a big moment with devolution and local growth plans taking shape, with a number of new strategic authorities and existing ones on stream. So I think this event could really not be more timely, as many colleagues around the country are thinking about how you can best fertilize creative businesses and attract talent, attract business to your area as part of that future growth. And as the National Development Agency for Culture, Arts Council England, we have long invested in Workspace. We can see how it supports individual artists and makers, but also the secondary benefits to communities, to society, and to help to keep high streets healthy and growing and local economies. And with that in mind, we funded the Creative Workspace Network, who's hosting this event today. And we've been talking to them for a few years now about how local authorities working with independent operators, studio operators, and also the creative practitioners and business owners themselves can work more together to unlock space, new space for cultural production, especially in places where affordability and permanence of those spaces are often under threat. But I do sometimes hear in my travel that, studios and workspaces is kind of a big London opportunity or a Manchester opportunity. But I think we've seen through the pandemic that these are businesses that are really resilient, that have bounced back quickly, that are always under occupied, are always well occupied, and really do underpin a broader creative industries. So we're hoping that today gives you some practical inspiration and helps to us to broaden our national conversation about this topic as we start to work forward. So with that in mind, I'd really like to hand over now to John Wakeman from East Street Arts. It's one of our national portfolio organizations, and East Street Arts is the one that funds and hosts the Creative Workspace Network. So John, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and hello, everyone. I am John Wakeman, and I am one of the co-founders of East Street Arts, and being one of the founders 30 years ago, so 30 plus years ago. And really, East Street Arts is really grounded in artist-led movement. It's about what the role of artists can take and how artists, once empowered, are able to play such a significant role in really changing the direction in which towns and cities can go. And that's been our sort of long-term sector experience, and particularly as ours here in Leeds. So we've grown from sort of, I mean, in a snapshot, what have we done? We've grown from being two people, myself and Karen, who you'll hear from in a sec, from taking on sort of 2,000 square foot in a mill, to not really knowing what the hell we were doing, but knowing we had an ambition, we wanted to do something different, that was already here. And I think most importantly, there was what we sensed were there was a gap. There was a gap for visual arts, particularly in Leeds at that time. And really it was that made things possible. It's that gap and being able to be consistently here and to, in many ways, doggedly pursue that endless void in front of us. So that's kind of grown us from that, and it's led us today to being what we are, as we are national, with national sort of influence. We deliver hundreds of meanwhile spaces. Over the years, we've been doing that for the last 12, 13 years. We've been doing meanwhile spaces. And while here in Leeds, we've got our three owned buildings, Patrick Studios, Convention House, and the Art Hostel. But I think as we've gone along, that what we found is the most important, and as myself and Karen have started to think again about what might be next, probably 10 years ago, it was kind of, well, what do you do? What do you do? This is great. We've done this. How do we pass on the information? How do we support other early career artists? And we've done this through, again, support of the Arts Council by running a 5-year programme guild, supported through the sector as a sector support organisation, as well as an NPO. And that was to support 25 organisations across the country. And that just really kind of solidified the work we do in supporting those fledgling organisations, or not even fledgling ones that perhaps wanted to grow, look at capital and look to make a home. Because I think what we've learned is that it's really about permanence. Permanence has been super important. It gives trust. It gives trust to the artists in that area. It gives confidence. And it also means you can build from it and build across the sector. and build those networks and actually just maintain that cornerstone in a place and then actually have an influence. So what really works is that kind of cross-sector collaboration. We can't do it alone. We don't do it alone. It has to be done with others. We have to tell other people about what we're doing. We work with councils, we work with other organizations, we collaborate with artists on projects, and it's really a team effort. And we have always tried to play that role as a good neighbor, shall we say, a good neighbor in our cities and the other towns we work in, and something we can be relied on. And that has grown, and we've relied on the Arts Council for that. We're also looking at how we collaborate further with CVAN and looking at what the national context is for that and how we raise the profile of what workspace is needed. And really, it's about a number of things coming together. And I think while we've been doing this piece of work as CWN and doing the research, there's one way to sum it up. There's sort of in a Venn diagram sort of way, there are three key elements. There is one which is that there's an appetite within a certain area, a town, from a local authority level, or significant support from a governing body within that area, that there are buildings that are available and of a caliber that can actually be walked into realistically, and also that there is an arts entrepreneurial kind of community within that area. And I think if you've got those three things and you inject some funds into that area, you're probably onto a winner. And with a little bit of support and a little bit of time together, you're looking at something that could have a real impact in that area. So I think it's saying it's we're not just a nice to have thing. We can actually kickstart areas and we have a real impact to make in infrastructure within our towns and cities. And it's not just us, it's other organizations. And that's me. And I will pass over to Karen, I believe.
No, I think it's to me, but
Oh, sorry,
thank you
Paul.
very much, John. Yeah, Karen will be joining us in a couple of moments. But first, a little bit of context. And maybe we'll define some terms. We've used this phrase maker-friendly workspace, which I think we coined years and years ago. And that's to try to distinguish the conversation about creative workspace between spaces that will only take clean office end users and buildings that will take other messier uses. We used to, I guess, call it studio space, but we're not just talking about space for artists. This could be space for makers, fabricators, people working in design, fashion, and a number of other areas, performing arts, photography. All of these types of groups are represented in the building that I'm sitting in at the moment. Now, generally, these are independent artists and creative practitioners. It includes people in for-profit activities, not-for-profit activities, and government-supported creative organizations. I mean, as a generalization, a lot of the creative industries are self-employed, and that's as high as 80% in these parts of the sectors. And it's worth noting that to make a living, it's quite usual for creative professionals to have portfolio careers, to be generating income from different sources, contracts, commissions, royalties, and often a secondary part-time salary job that makes up part of their income. But it'd be useful to know what these studio holders actually look like. So let's now talk to Karen, a person who knows. Karen, are you here?
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all. And as we've already said, I am one of the co-founders of E Street Arts. And some of the more specific roles that I had during the last 30 years, it was sitting on lots of strategic networky type networks, whether they were National Federation for Artist Providers, Studio Providers, kind of that title always gets me, or whether it's a government strategy group. I tried to take a very strategic view from locally to nationally to internationally. We've also done a lot of visiting of really interesting spaces across Europe, right down to a really focused artist support program that I was always very involved in. But the interesting thing for me is wherever I started, whether it was sat in front of an artist who needed some support or in a big strategic group that was looking at what the kind of priorities for that town or city, space was always incredibly important to everybody, and we could not get away from that fact. And John mentioned guilds earlier, and what we tried to do with guild was break down what that space actually meant, because we do use all these different descriptions: artist spaces, studio groups, maker friendly, but it is basically spaces that just accommodate artists to make, sometimes sleep, talk about, show their work. And that, I think, is where I have to give you two case studies out of thousands and thousands of artists that I've worked with. And I'm going to talk about Tanith. Tanith came to us as a graduate and very raw, doing some amazing stuff. She actually answered a call that we put out to respond to our art hostel, and we were asking artists to create an immersive artistic experience in every room of our hostel. And Tanith came along, put in an application, and she just wasn't ready for that, but we loved her work, we loved her approach. So we kind of said, hey, why don't you come and do a residency with us? We offered her a studio space, and we actually offered her some accommodation because she was homeless at the time. And over the course of a year, maybe 18 months, she would come and go, make use of the space, make use of the accommodation when she needed to, but also make use of the supportive environment that we placed her in. So she got mentoring, she got some crits, she got some artist talks around her, and she just blossomed. And it did actually change her life. And she was able to go and take the work that she was doing and transfer it into lots of different ways of working. She's now working for Manchester International Festival. I think that's probably a salaried post. She's still doing her work. She's got an exhibition at the moment at Paradise Works. So have a look at what Paradise Works has got on in Manchester. She's one of the artists there. And I think, so that's an example of an artist that came to us, that came and went, came when they needed some support, moved on, still in touch, still comes back when she just needs a bit of advice. And in comparison, I'm going to talk about Steve Miller, who actually joined our studio family as soon as we opened Patrick Studio. So 2004, he was one of our first artists to join, and he was a painter. And he was also trying to earn a living doing some graphic design. And during some programming that we put in place for all our studio holders, which were sessions to give them some support and give them some advice, he went along to a session where we brought in a really well-known Leeds designer, and it made Paul realise that actually that design world wasn't probably for him. And he changed track, and that change of track again completely changed his life as he started to collaborate with another colleague in one of the studios that he met during an open studio event. And they're now doing incredibly immersive projections using different technology. The artist that he works with is a glassmaker. They're being commissioned by science research institutions and other innovative research agencies. And that has been able to help him combine some income generation with all the things that he loved about his original work, which is creative, making, content driven. So, two examples, and out of many, many, many we could have pulled out, but it's just really useful, I think, to just get a little bit of an insight into the different ways artists come in and go through, make the most of, leave some traces of what they've done and move on into the world and do all the things that John, I think, alluded to.
Karen, thank you. That's great. I guess Workspace, one of the brilliant things about it, especially like co-located workspace, is it gives people a shop window, doesn't it? It gives them a bit of a platform, a bit of visibility. But the stories there, and I mean, especially mentioning open studios and these sort of expert talks that we're running, it's that collaboration and inspiration that can lead people off in new directions. So, these are places that kind of, help people develop their practice and their direction. Now, it's worth saying that these are independent people with inconsistent and varied income streams. What they need is fairly simple. They need affordable, flexible, collaborative space, but it's often in very short supply. Now, I'm mentioning the word affordable, and by that, what we mean is these spaces generally command a rent that's broadly equivalent to out-of-town light industrial premises. And in our part of the world, that means something like £16 per square foot per annum in old traditional property terms, including a service charge. And that's for stable, kind of long-term space. Now, the truth is that the current landscape of studio space is dominated by meanwhile provision, temporary leases of otherwise vacant buildings. And that space is often a good bit cheaper than that, perhaps 2/3 of that rate. But it's very insecure. People may have to leave that space within a couple of months. The space may well not be heated, and it's probably in a fairly primitive condition. Now, this meanwhile use, this probably 80% of studio space, it's fulfilling different purposes. For the building owners, it's reducing rates liabilities, but it's got real value for places and for early stage operators of studio space. It's agile, low cost, it gets people and activity into underused areas quickly. And more than that, it can build a track record for small artist space providers, increase their visibility and put them on a course towards longer term or even permanent space. I think the punchline, having done quite a lot of work looking at the ecosystem of creative space over the years, is that there is market failure in the supply of longer term studio space. It doesn't command much rent. The private sector is therefore not interested in making secure longer term provision available. There's no financial profit to be had from operating these spaces directly, but not-for-profit organisations can run them sustainably given initial support. And there are a wide range of benefits to the end users, the public sector, and surrounding communities, which we're going to come to through the interviews and the roundup at the end. The successful examples you're going to hear about today started out with public sector enabling and de-risking, taking the first steps and providing initial access to space and trusting that creative people will do the rest. Our collective ambition is for security of tenure for these uses, for long-term stewardship, and where possible, ownership, particularly by independent and not-for-profit end users. And the public sector has a role to play in this by adopting the vision, enabling the funding, and opening up opportunities. So next, we're going to move into some conversations with people in Hull, Luton, and Middlesbrough, each of whom have their own starting point, model, and momentum. This isn't intended to be a glossy presentation, and we won't be bombing you with loads of slides. They're stories of persistence, experimentation, and place-based imagination that reflect on what worked, what didn't, and what might be coming next. Now, we will be recording this session and we'll be making it available, so don't worry too much about making notes. And finally, before we begin, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll find a Q&A button in the Zoom window, and you can use that to ask questions or make comments, address them to any of the 3 panel members or us as a group, and we'll gather those questions together and put them to the panel afterwards. So the next step is we're going to have a quarter of an hour or so talking about each location, and then we'll spend a quarter of an hour or so having a roundtable discussion and picking up your questions. And as we go through the case studies, we invite you to think about the places you work, what's possible there, what might be missing, and what kinds of partnerships could unlock new space. And with that, let's begin in Hull, or to give it its Sunday name, Kingston upon Hull, which was, you may remember, the UK City of Culture 2017. Paul, welcome.
Hello, hi. Hi, everyone. I should start by, I really want to say hello to my hopefully friends from East Street Arts, because we haven't spoken in a long time, and I do appreciate the work that you've done in Hull, and let's just say we need to talk, because there is a history there which I won't go into, but I absolutely appreciate the work that East Street Arts have tried to do over the years in Hull. Much appreciated. So yeah, I just wanted to talk. I was asked to talk about the fruit market area in Hull, which we're very fortunate historically and geographically. Hull has a pier, a tiny little pier. It's onto the River Humber, behind which historically was the fruit market area, which was exactly as it sounds. It's a collection of small warehouses, traders, florists, fruiterers, grocers, warehousing, supplying the various independent shops across the city for well over a century. As we got into the 21st century, all of those were dying out, advanced to the supermarkets and so on and so forth. And so by the noughties, you had an area of the town which was sort of sandwiched between the old town shopping centre of Hull and the River Humber and the marina. So geographically, actually quite an interesting and potentially quite an exciting space. This wasn't a space that was tucked away on a trading estate somewhere. And in fact, what happened was that those trades moved to a trading estate somewhere, leaving behind a whole collection of some beyond repair, but some kind of quite interesting old buildings. And the city council ended up buying most of them. And then there were a number of attempts at developing that space. And eventually, won't bore you with all of that, eventually there was a partnership formed with a local developer. There was a lot of visioning done, which Paul actually was part of, in terms of what could be done with those spaces. And by the late noughties and into sort of 2010, they were talking about priority lettings for meanwhile uses for arts and creative end users. Now, I'm just listening to that introduction and some of the things that have been said there. Absolutely, wholeheartedly in agreement with the aims and the whole flavour of this, which is some of the lessons that we've learned. So, just briefly, back in 2010. The talk was about priority lettings to these kind of creatives. I think originally on a map there were 7 or 8, including a brewery and a coffee shop. Beyond that, the people that were working on it, a now defunct organisation called Hold Forward, which was our kind of investment arm, really didn't know how to engage with beyond their own kind of knowledge. So we held, part of Arts Development at City Council, actually contacting a great number of people. We had in the end, I think there were about 70 odd small organisations, people, artists, individuals who came forward and said they'd like to get a space. We couldn't help all of them, but a good number and a good range from jewellers, a stonemason, an artist, a visual artist, space painter, a potter, and so on. So a really interesting range of things. Now, the lesson was that you take the combination of a geographically interesting, exciting space near to the River Humber with a history. You chuck in a whole load of investment, and this is where it was easy for me at the time to feel very cynical about what happened next, because we got those creatives in there. It made the place really hip, really funky, really interesting. And there followed a whole load of welcome investment, which has now resulted in the Humber Street, as it's well known, as it's known in the city, becoming very much a kind of evening and weekend destination, full of restaurants, bars, a wedding shop, a kind of one of those shishi gallery type spaces, but very little in terms of actually maker spaces anymore, because they can't afford to be there. A common lesson that we've all been in, that we've all seen. And like I say, I think it is. It was both a really exciting time, and I remember taking Karen Durham from the Arts Council. Peter, you'll probably know her, around Humber Street in, I think, 2009, something like that. And the Arts Council were absolutely as excited as we were about the potential for those spaces. And so everybody did put a lot of effort into making those spaces accessible, because all sorts of problems, from asbestos to water ingress, all kinds of things. But we managed it, and we got a community of arts end users in there. In the sort of last 15 years, of course, what's happened is those have gradually been eroded, and you can only find 2 or 3 now that are actually still there. And I think that leaves us, cynicism aside, with the realization that there were 1 or 2 voices at the time, I have to say, including quite a senior elected member, calling for the creation of a trust to take ownership of some of those buildings to ensure the ongoing security of those arts users. The push from the developers, and indeed our own kind of economic development people in the council, was not to accept that. And there was a sort of a commitment to a kind of percentage deal where there would be cheaper rents and so on and so forth, which I have to say, from my perspective and my perspective only, that hasn't really worked. So you've ended up with a very interesting, busy nighttime user space that was much needed in the city, that's been physically very much improved and includes some residential areas and so on. It's a nice place to walk around. But what we've actually done is, in the process, we've forgotten about those creatives that we were going to try and accommodate. And we're now back in the situation where we are looking again at how do we find creative spaces for for primarily visual artists, but of the kind that Paul was describing earlier, that makers can be in all kinds. More recently, East Street Arts helped us in with the use of a city centre office building, and there was in fact another building just near that, which up until, what was it, 18 months ago, had 53 artists in it, and went through the usual kind of heartbreaking thing about having a year, 53 artists, including, we had a theatre company in there, pole dancers, we had a recording studio, photographer, all sorts of people. It was wonderful. But then getting that letter from the developers, the building had been sold and it was imminent, they all had to leave. So we're back a little bit to square one. That's not to say that the seeds of that have happened have taught a lot of people, beyond myself, a lot of good lessons. And it does leave people with a realization. And as people move on, and as like within planning, within our economic development, there's a more mature understanding of what those challenges are. I can tell you, like 10 to 15 years ago, and Karen and John, they've had experience of dealing with other sections of Hull City Council. I've had senior managers say to me, well, they're clearly lying, was one quote. They're clearly lying about their income because nobody could possibly survive on that little money. And you just, that doesn't happen anymore, I'm glad to say. So there is much that, these kind of fundamentals have changed, and that's really interesting and puts us in a better place than we were. But those are some of the challenges, and that's the kind of journey that you have to go on to realize that it's like I say, it's easy to be cynical and go, well, they're just exploiting artists in order to upgrade a space. From their perspective, it's completely different. It's all about that kind of regenerative investment opportunity and so on. And that's perfectly fine and understandable. We're in a place now where I'm trying to convince artists that they actually don't need to work in the city centre. If you go to, I know Newcastle very well. Having started my career in Newcastle, we did an exhibition in the CWS warehouse. It's now a Malmaison. Trying to work on, if you tried the artist studio on Newcastle Quayside now, it costs you millions. Back then, an artist studio group in Newcastle in 1985 was offered an entire block next to Live Theatre for 15,000 quid. Think about that. That's ridiculous. But yeah, the lesson is there that, now actually we can talk about the need for ownership of spaces by artists, and that they don't need to be in the city centre. If you look at Ousburn in Newcastle, that was the most unfashionable place you could think of. You don't have to have a tourist destination in order to have artist studios and so on and so forth. You can make it so once they're there, but it's not a prerequisite. I'm conscious of time here, so stop me if I'm getting repetitive. But that's kind of my thinking on this whole issue, is that we've been full circle. And there has been a learning curve. It was extremely important for us in 2017, of course, to have been able to have done that and show that. And it really helped with the relationship with the Arts Council, that they'd invest that money, and there was a vibrancy to that area. And so on. But like I say, time moves on, property values change, businesses change, and so on and so forth. The pressures are many, and we're all familiar with them. I think what we didn't anticipate was how fast that would happen, and the need to preempt it, to predict that, and make planning. Although, as I say, there were voices that were asking for that back then. I think perhaps we should have listened to them more carefully.
And fascinating, Paul, because I remember working with you back then in 2010. It was 11 businesses who moved in first. Right. That was the first wave of occupiers. Yeah. And this was part of the conversation. What happens if this project becomes really successful and the area is gentrified? How will we protect a corner of it in the long term? But to be honest, I don't think anyone believed it would happen. But it was, in fact, a runaway success in the sense that, we talk about I mean, this wasn't a meanwhile use in the traditional sense, because those first occupiers had 3 and 5 year leases, didn't they?
Yeah.
They had a bit of a runway, but they say regeneration takes a generation, and you've now got 15 years perspective on how that area has developed, which is fascinating, isn't it? But they say, private sector developers such as Wakeman Beale that Hull got into a partnership with, the sort of benefits they might get from maker type space projects. And don't forget, all of these units had sort of shop fronts, didn't they? That were public facing units. But yeah, there's placemaking and activation that drives footfall. The sort of brand building that those independent people who come and commit to space and bring energy and enthusiasm, they make the reputation of the place. They bring the buzz to it, and the impact is that over time it increases property values, and it becomes a catalyst for further neighbouring development, which is exactly what's happened in Hull.
I absolutely would agree, but I think there's another way of looking at it, and that's from the point of view of the artist. If I can tell, I'm sort of old-fashioned, I still call them that. And that is that, in my experience, if you think about different art forms, if you think about drama, for instance, they're very used to organising themselves. You don't do drama on your own, particularly. So, in order to produce a play, you need a group of people. You need to work together. It's in your blood. That's how you make things. Visual artists and individual practitioners, craftspeople, whatever, they don't necessarily work that way. I've worked with so many artist groups, and that there is a real process, and people can find it really difficult because it's always about who's going to step forward. I remember 40 years ago in Newcastle, artists arguing over, well, I'm going to buy the stamps, but who's going to put them on the envelopes? It's because it's not the way they normally work. Yeah, I mean, Karen, you might tell me I'm completely wrong on this, but that's always been my experience. So it's who do you get to champion these things? You combine that with councils and the Arts Council who like to deal with organisations. So that sort of makes things easier. But a gallery MPO is never going to these days going to start an initiative. Tell me I'm probably wrong on this, but be the champion of studio spaces. That's why people like East Street Arts are so important. But locally, artist groups find it very difficult to organise to a degree in which they are empowered to go and confident enough to go and talk about properties and research and actually make those kind of investments happen. So it's difficult for us as authorities to engage with anything other than the kind of micro business. And I think that's one of the problems here is that institutions like local authority, we like to deal with big bodies that have got bank accounts and we know where we are and they're sound investments. There's no risk. And artist groups not necessarily like that. I think that's one of the challenges that we have to overcome.
How did Fruit Market became really cool?
Yeah.
How did it become so cool, Paul?
Yeah, you're asking me. A couple of reasons, I suppose. One of the most important things was Freedom Festival brought Carabosse in. Before anything else, Carabosse, a French performance group, and they filled the whole street with fire in one form or another, freaked people out. It was wonderful and beautiful. That set the scene. We are Humber Street Sesh, which is a big kind of independent music festival which takes place every year. That centres itself there. Freedom was centred there for a long time. And then you chuck in a few things like having having a jeweller's on one corner and Stephen Harry's cafe on the other. And it was just sort of, a bit of well-placed graffiti street art. And suddenly you're creating a mood, It wasn't actually necessarily by design, but I certainly think the decisions that we took in terms of different types of work around helped. Yeah. So there was no monotone nature to it, So
Yeah.
you could, one end of the street you did have a jeweler, and the other end you had studio spaces, and in between you had a music recording studio at one point, and a potter. So I think that helps definitely.
Yeah.
It creates points of interest.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So that's great, Paul. Come back to us in we'll be about 25 minutes and have a listen in, but we're going to have a sort of a get together again and pick up any questions that people have raised. Thank you for the moment. Brilliant. Now let's move to Luton. Marie, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me all right?
I can. Hello, Marie. Lovely to see you.
Hello. I was just laughing at Paul because I was one of those artists in Newcastle, a little bit later than you, but I was one. I graduated from Newcastle, and I had a number of studios across the town, kept getting moved on. And in a way, I was failed as a creative because it wasn't cheap enough, it wasn't free enough. And from my experience, artists want free space. They don't really care what it was. I had some awful spaces with no heating, no electricity, windows smashed through. It's free. Yeah. It's all about lots of space and low cost. But anyway, I've become, I am that poacher come gamekeeper. So I saw there was a problem. I could see what was happening in Newcastle at the time. I lived in lots of places in the north, and it's a pattern that's not new. And it started in New York. It started in Soho, some 50 years ago. And I went recently to Hackney, and it's happening there. These amazing creative clusters and groups are getting moved away for apartments and buildings. So we're not learning. For some reason, we're not learning here. And we've got to draw some conclusions from this. I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this discussion, particularly with local authorities, because I really do believe that it sits with local authorities to really help here. Anyway, I will tell you a little bit more about Luton.
Yes, do. I mean, tell us about Luton Culture Trust.
Yeah.
Or so the Culture Trust Luton. Yeah.
We're a charity. We were set up by the council in 2008 to run a more efficient operation for creative services, as were museums, art centres, heritage, and so forth. And so some 17 years later, we've gone through all of the changes that many independent trusts have gone through. Lots of changes in funding, in terms of how we operate and the need to be independent. And I started at the Culture Trust in 2015. And part of what I did was just to look and absorb place. And Luton's very similar to a lot of northern towns. It's post-industrial. And in the area called the Hat District, which is where we've got one of our venues, which you see behind me, which is the Hat Factory Arts Centre, which was owned by the council, which we operated from. Around that, there were a number of beautiful similar buildings, empty or underused, or maybe the top floor was being used as a penthouse. And there was a real opportunity there to actually take some of the learning from the north that had a lot of regeneration funding to refurbish a lot of the old mills and a lot of the former industrial buildings that wasn't happening in Luton. And part of my mandate in running the trust was to look for some new sustainable method of being able to operate into the future. And we harnessed this as an opportunity, really entrepreneurial board who could understand what the benefits would be of buying property. We took them on lots of go and sees. We looked at other places like Birmingham, Manchester, and Folkestone as well. Really good models there. And they could see how if we bought the property and developed it through grants and funding and support, that we would have a stronghold in Luton. And whilst Luton at the time was, suffering decline in the town centre, to a certain extent it still is. The trust recognise that we're around for the long term as a charity, and therefore we're investing into a long-term future of creatives in the town centre. And as developments take place around us, we want to ensure that we lock in a place for creatives into the long term. So we bought 2 hat factories. We were very lucky. They weren't on the market. We were able to negotiate them pretty well. And we started our project in 2016. And if I can just talk you through what we did. No right way here, but just by getting creative people together, it's a perhaps different method from a local authority. So we started with a very creative push. So artists, creatives, coming together, a group of curators. We got funding from the Arts Council to deliver a project that was a disruptor. It created lots of public art on the outside. It brought things into the presence of people, and it disrupted people from their regular route and walk between the shopping centre and the train station. One of the first commissions I did was the piece behind me, which is by Mark Titchener, who's an artist from the area. It's a big illuminated piece. You see it from the train if you're ever going through Luton, and it's a major successful icon. People see it as a method of demonstrating the pride they feel of place. And it was interesting to see that that was commissioned in 2016, or it was launched in 2016. And it's now still, it's the front cover of the economic growth strategy for Luton. And that's 2025 to 32.
Yep.
Lasts, these things can last. So we started with creative curiosity, getting people engaged. This got the community involved in looking at buildings differently, heritage differently, arts differently. We did street parties, we did lots of accessible pieces of public engagement. We then, and this is where I met Paul, did a piece of market analysis, so we did things from both ends, and that was very favourable, particularly with our proximity to London and a lot of the digital creatives that were working independently in Luton, scattered across the town. We then put the concept together. I think a lot of people just thought, this is just a ridiculous idea, what you're doing. Then I applied for a local growth fund through our LEP, and that was the seed funding that we got. They gave us £3.9 million, and I think everyone then sort of went, okay, there might be something here. And from that, we were then able to build up a £10 million capital development programme. And the learning for us as an arts and cultural charity was talk the language of the funder, which was about jobs and workspace and the economy, whereas a lot of arts organisations are traditionally more interested in talking about creative outputs, cultural outputs and cultural and creative processes, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what I would say to you is, don't expect artists to talk in that language. You do need a converter, and that's where charities and trusts are really good intermediaries. So then the capital project took place 2017 to 21-22. We had COVID in the middle, and we're still evolving. We've got about 20 creative industries in our cluster, 15,000 square feet. We have everything from free support through to £24 per square foot. So I was interested, Paul, in that average costing. We have a lot around about 16, but we have a model where if they can afford it, you pay it. So we've got some creative industries that give us a full commercial rent, and that helps us support that whole creative charitable model whereby we can afford to support free and emerging practitioners through the ecology. Our long-term plan is that the income that we generate through our buildings pays for our not-for-profit activity. It takes time, but that's our vision.
It's really impressive and, so brave. But I guess the thing about your organization is that you see, or you've got a vision that culture is going to have a central role in the future of Luton. And I guess that's what's tilted you towards creative workspace as opposed to just any old workspace. And the fact that you are receptive to makers, not only to clean office uses. Tell us a bit about who's in these spaces.
Well, if I can just start by saying that, you can't invent things from scratch. So Luton is a place that's known for making, industry, manufacturing. It makes cars and hats. Obviously, all these buildings were former hat factories. So there's an ingrained, embedded creative voice that the town's already got. So we were just amplifying that. But over time, the hat making industry started in the 1600s and it's depleting. And we've got very few hat factories now. But one of our challenges was to make sure that we continue to support making. So we're really pleased that one of our first anchor tenants in one of our buildings is a hat maker, Panama hat maker. So we've got making, production, global business. We've got marketing, photography, we've got fine artists, digital, fashion, design, pottery, theatre companies. We've got a real mixture of people that work well together. We're still growing the ecology though. It's really important that we have that pipeline, and that's where partners come in. We've got the creative industry university next door, and we've got really good connections with schools and colleges, and through larger businesses as well. So at the moment we're trying to paint a picture of what that ecology looks like, particularly for young people, by developing training and development programs, so it's really clear how they can use their talents and skills.
Brilliant. I think something that we had a chat about the other week was creating stepping stones, opportunities for people to get into making, or try their hand at it. And you've got some projects coming on those lines, haven't you, in terms of shared space?
Yeah, we've got, we call them our pioneers. It's a group of people who we work with and learn from. We started that in 2016 when we did the capital works. What do you want? How do you want to work? What sort of environment do you want? How do you want to work together? And we've seen different trends in how people want to work either together or separately. And we follow those. We don't try and do anything too fixed. So at the moment, we're just setting up a new makerspace because people are wanting equipment again. They're wanting sewing machines. And whereas 5 years ago, people were saying they didn't want that. They wanted a homely environment. And I think that related to COVID. So we are very responsive. I think that key is not to be too rigid in how you do things and be responsive to how people need to step or want to step. And if you've got the space and you've got the flexibility, allow things to grow organically within those spaces. We call it freedom in a framework. We provide the framework as a charity and we allow freedom within it. And we're not afraid of failure either. We know that this our response to creatives needs to evolve and respond to their needs.
It's interesting that local growth funding was what enabled you to really get traction and purchase this sort of first asset, independent asset of yours. Where do you think the next projects are coming from? What does the future funding streams look like for your relentless expansion of the Hat District?
Well, we've got funding from the Architectural Heritage Fund and the Heritage Lottery Fund as part of a Heritage Network Trust, which it cuts across the whole of Britain. The idea is to grow ecology by reusing historic buildings that are underused in places. It's not necessarily for the creative industries. And so we've been given a little bit of a support there to get a project manager to work with us on our next phase of buildings. And what the sector is seeing is concerns about purchasing the buildings. We need to purchase them. So some authorities give buildings to trusts and charities. Some work in partnership with developers about doing the front end work that can get grant funded, and then developers will pick it up and then turn the profit and hand back part of the building. But Community Ownership Fund was used at a point, but now we're not really seeing any way in which we can buy buildings. So there's work for us to do in Luton, but we've got no funds to buy it. We have to be really clever. What we do is we're refinancing our buildings, so we remortgage them in old terms. That's not very sustainable for a charity and it's kind of risky. But this is something where local authorities, I think, could help with soft loans and to help with that risk management and perhaps partner in and enable trusts to buy up properties, because we have access for grants. We have access for grants to do up the buildings, to maintain the buildings and put them to good use that others don't. So I think that's where a true partnership could come.
Fascinating, and maybe something that we can come back to in the questions and answers. Marie, thank you for the moment. We'll talk again in a few minutes. Now, let's come to Middlesbrough. Gay, Michelle, Anna. Gay.
Hello.
Welcome. Well, it's lovely to see you again, Gay. And I think we've got a bit of microphone issue going on somewhere, but I should press on. Michelle and Anna and Gay, perhaps you could introduce yourselves quickly and just tell us how you fit into this story about creative workspace and regeneration.
Thanks, Paul. I'll kick off briefly. So my name's Gay Kirby. I'm Head of Culture at Middlesbrough Council. So I've been here for about 3 years. And when I arrived here, I think one of the most notable things for me was we had a really thriving cultural partnership. So a kind of non-constituted group of organisations who were coming together to advocate for the sector and to work collaboratively, bring investment into Middlesbrough for creativity. And at the same time, I think from a kind of regen point of view, we were thinking about what Middlesbrough town centre was going to be going forward, like lots of town centres, losing our retail, and sort of started on a journey with the cultural partnership really to create a vision for Middlesbrough that absolutely embeds culture and creativity at the heart of regeneration and the heart of the town's transformation. So I suppose that's kind of been our starting point, and then work has kind of evolved from there in terms of how we make that happen. But that's probably just a brief intro from me, and I'll pass on to Anna.
Yeah, hi everybody. So I suppose I moved to Middlesbrough in about 2016, and myself and my partner started running artist-led spaces there, and that culminated in moving to Middlesbrough, and actually a discussion with Michelle around space, and she introduced us to a landlord who had a warehouse that he was definitely not selling, and then which we about 3 years on purchased through a mix of some funds and some social investment. So that's kind of my background of what I've been working in, and currently I've just been seconded to the Creative Factory role, which is basically looking at how we can use this £2 million of funding that we've secured through Middlesbrough Council in creating more sustainable space in Middlesbrough and hopefully across the Tees Valley. And I suppose just echoing, I suppose what Marie and Paul were saying about, you know, meanwhile space, in my view, is so useful. But what you see kind of again and again, I suppose, is artists developing a space and then being priced out. So the idea that we're looking at in Middlesbrough is just securing that space so that it's owned by the cultural sector. And so then that it can stay in there in those hands.
Michelle.
Hi, I'll try and keep this brief. So I'm Michelle McPhee. I'm the Town Centre Manager at Middlesbrough Council, and I work in the Economic Growth team. But unlike Paul from Hull, our Economic Growth team hopefully sees things a little bit differently. Back in 2012, I was tasked with being a project manager, but I have a focus on the town centre. And we had 2 derelict streets in the town centre, which used to be residential. And at the time, Mary Porter had done a review of the high street, and there was some funding available. And I begged our director at the time, please, can I have some money to sort of regenerate them 2 streets, because Middlesbrough at the time had huge competition with our out-town retail park and with the online shopping. And I wanted to create a street full of independence to make Middlesbrough different, because that was the only way we were going to compete. And then 2 streets, which are called Baker Street and Bedford Street, are full of independent businesses and still are today. And we also launched a sort of food street market. And back then, it was we need a market organizer, and I said we need a creative to come in and really curate that space and really bring in something different that's going to attract people from outside of the area. And we launched Orange Pip Market, which has been a huge success. Roll forward to 2017, and I was appointed as the town centre manager for Middlesbrough, and like many towns and city centres, the town centre has faced huge challenges with the decline of retail, the decline of the high street, empty buildings, low footfall. And I've said to my directors and the mayor and, you know, political leaders, you know, for Middlesbrough, we need to be different. And I wanted to emulate what I did on Baker Bedford Street, but working with creatives. And luckily, we finally had a culture team, which we've not always had. I've been here 25 years, and we've never really had a head of culture in post. And now I work really, really closely with Gay and with Anna on how we can repurpose Middlesbrough Town Centre, how we can repurpose space to not only support the creative sector in the town, but also support the town centre and animate and bring people in.
Brilliant. Let me jump in here because this conversation about the collaboration between officers in Middlesbrough is, I think, really, really interesting. As I understand it, you've managed to embed cultural regeneration in as, part of the vision for the future of Middlesbrough Town Centre. And you've embedded it within the local plans, and then you found a way of working strategically between property and assets and culture to identify underutilized buildings owned by the council, which have got potential to, be released for cultural uses. I'd really love you and Gay to just have a 2-minute sort of chat about that and tell us how you managed to achieve it.
Shall I kick off with the plan, Michelle, and then I'll hand over to you about sort of working with assets. So when we as a kind of cultural partnership created the creative vision for Middlesbrough, which is a 10-year plan, there was a really strong focus within that on spaces and this whole question of ownership and permanency, or at least long-term leases on good terms where things are affordable and accessible, as has been talked about previously. So it was a big strand of the vision. And then we started some work on a master plan following that vision, because that was the kind of high-level ambition. And then it was like, how do we deliver that? And we started to identify areas across the town where there was already some existing creative clusters, or areas that were kind of ripe to develop, or that we wanted to protect for creativity. And at the time, it was just accidental good timing. Our local plan was due for renewal. So we effectively wrote a cultural policy based on that vision and master plan. And worked with our planning team to incorporate it. So it was really kind of understanding what the local plan is all about and how it serves those two purposes of both kind of identifying opportunities for development, but also protecting areas for certain purposes. So we were able to kind of express our vision and our objectives and those opportunities for creative development in the local plan, so that it doesn't guarantee everything, but it does mean that those things have to be considered when proposals come through. So I think from a policy perspective, that was the first time it had ever happened in Middlesbrough. So it was a bit of a line in the sand for us to have that. And then I think sort of once we had that was the beginnings of sort of engaging with wider teams within the council about how do we make it easier for the creative sector to access spaces, including council-owned spaces, because that was probably the biggest challenge at the time. East Street Arts
you managed to identify, like by working with colleagues, you managed to identify buildings that didn't have income targets, which were underutilized. I mean, maybe Michelle, can you pick that up?
Yeah, so I work closely with our assets team, and this is not mean to be offensive, but they've been doing the same thing for years, you know. And when I joined the council in the early 2000s, we had something called enterprise centres, and it was all focusing around businesses. So it was easier in easy out terms for businesses to occupy. And over the years and years, that concept has sort of been neglected, if you like, and the buildings became empty or used as storage. But our assets team don't really think outside the box at all. So when I started working with Gay and realised that actually there was a requirement from the cultural sector that needed meanwhile space, and not just, you know, studio space, it was, you know, space for making things and all that type of thing. I thought, well, our enterprise centres, that really initially was the whole idea. That's what they were there for. But rather than being specific around culture, it was around wider business. So a lot of it my role really is just been trying to make our asset team see sense. And obviously they hate me because all I do is go on and on and on until they actually listen to me and we get something done. So recently we had an enterprise centre which was in between our town centre and industrial sort of estate called Stockton Street, and we had two artists, Gay and Anne will probably be speaking more about what they actually do, but they required sort of a workshop space. And Stockton Street Workshops has got this huge workshop space that is not used, and it used to be used for community use. And they also have these studio spaces that are just used as storage. And I was like, no, this is, we can't have this. So over the past few months, I've been working with our asset team and the two artists, and we've now managed to lease two of those spaces on a peppercorn rent, and they've only got to pay the service charge. And not only are they going to be able to use the space for their for making things, they're going to actually bring the community workshop back into use, and they're going to have use of the outdoor space, and they've got sort of free reign to do what they want. And if we hadn't intervened, that would just have been left for storage, and these two artists maybe would have gone elsewhere. And my focus is getting more and more activity in the town centre, repurposing space and giving it a use, because gone are the days where we're going to be able to fill town centres with retail, and that's been my focus really.
So this diversification of town centre uses is really important, and basically it's a bit of a pincer movement, isn't it? In that you're activating underutilised council assets and getting independence into them, and you're also drawing in external funding through the authority and building a property portfolio, and through that engaging more independence. So I mean, it's quite a story. I think,
and also, Paul, just on that, it's not just council properties. My role as well is to sort of be that relationship management with landlords, who basically who have got empty properties, to get them to actually, consider use for creative industries. And it's not just about why have you build an empty and be liable for business rates when you could have you're supporting someone in there, and maybe look at a stepped rent where over time the rents increase, as a way to support the creative sector, but also to get a building back into use.
Lovely. Great, thank you, Anna. I'm sorry you didn't get much time there, but there's the question and answers to come. Gay and Michelle, thank you. Right, now I think that's been really interesting to meet you all. I know that some questions I can see via my chat here, that I think some questions are starting to drop through we've got a few here in the inbox already. As I just have a quick look through these, can I ask the audience to have a think about one other thing? What else would you like to know? What would be useful for you? What is there information and guidance which maybe could be provided through the Creative Workspace Network? If there are more events in the future of this type, you'd be very welcome to shape the agenda for them. Just drop them in the Q&A. And I should also thank Wes Foster here at East Street Arts, who has been diligently reading your questions and feeding a selection of them through. So if your question didn't make the cut, that is Wes's fault and not mine. Thank you. Just thought I'd mention that. So let me pull something up here. Yeah, there's a question. I think this is just for Marie in the first instance, but we're being asked, what was the initial impetus for establishing the Culture Trust? And does the council retain a culture function in addition to the trust? Or is the trust the sole body for the local authority?
Yeah, Brilliant question. I get asked this a lot, and I probably should have explained. There are a set of unique circumstances in Luton, but I do think there's learning to other places. So the local authority, Luton Borough Council, own the airport. And at the time when the trust was set up, it was found to be a cost-efficient way for charities and trusts and some services that weren't discretionary in the council to be funded through the airport. You know, I think the learning there is that as a local authority, if you've got a big property portfolio yourself, like a big shopping centre or an airport, is there a clever way in which you can fund directly by way of a donation or sponsorship, arts and culture?
Right. Thank you very much. That's fascinating. We've got a question here for Anna. Could you give us a bit of thinking about creative land trusts?
Well, this is what we're trying to include in our business model at the moment as we build up Creative Factory. So to develop into a charity and to also develop a creative land trust. And our reasoning for that is so that we can ensure that the cultural sector's voice is heard, so that we know that we're going in a direction that's useful and that's needed. So we're just at the start of that journey now, and it's starting in Middlesbrough with some spaces. So we've bought a space in the town centre, and we're also looking at residential. So looking at either looking at some surplus stock or that is in need of renovation, or other ways of getting some residential space for live workspace as well. Am I forgetting anything, Gay?
No, I don't think so. I think that's it. It's just it's a potential mechanism, isn't it? For we got £2 million of levelling up partnerships money into the authority, which initially we were going to spend on the refurb and development of one building as creative space, and then that building was sold by the council, and so Creative Factory was established with Anna to be the vehicle for delivering that 2 million investment into creative space. And as Anna's just said, the idea is to build that portfolio of properties, some of which can be investment properties, which can then be reinvested back into that sector development, and others that will be made available to the sector, but managed through that creative land trust. So as Anna says, you have that wider ownership, and that's a model that the combined authority are really interested in seeing how that might roll out.
And I just add that's I mean an integral part of that is the conversations and having everybody in a room to discuss that. So that's local authority, combined authority, people that own property, and obviously as well artists. So I think a big piece of the work we've been doing in developing that and coming to that conclusion is making sure that we're speaking to everybody as we move along that journey, because I think John said it there, like, you can't do this on your own. You need everybody's buy-in, and you need to keep the conversation going and bring as many people with you as you can.
John, come in on this.
I mean, I've answered one of the questions a bit more long form around the Creative Land Trust, which I think was in answer to someone in Sheffield. And it's an interesting one for us because we ourselves take a particular stance on it because of the way potentially it becomes a direct competition for organizations and creative workspaces who are already doing those kind of works in an area. So for us in Leeds, if a creative land trust was to be proposed in anywhere within our sort of where we see our reach, we would be arguing that actually you're doubling up on the skills and expertise of an organization that already exists within an area and is perhaps better placed and to actually deliver on that in the places that it's perhaps needed. And again, it comes around. Paul Holloway also said, I thought that was really interesting what you said, Paul, about where you go in terms of spaces, because it's something around that we've just started to talk about myself, because I'm working on a project in Keighley where we're delivering in partnership with another charity, Keighley Creative, who started the process of a funding process that we're actually working on and finalising delivering a sort of £4 million conversion of an ex-co-op in Keighley. And so it's saying where are the centres? You're always going to be driven out of the city centres and areas by developers because their schemes are so large and long, and artists go to the places that are near, cheap, and convenient, and the developers are already earmarked those years before. They're just not moving on them because capital and that sort of process takes 20, 30 years. And so unless you're extremely lucky, you've got a naive landlord who owns a property who sells it, or someone who's very friendly and sees and understands your mission to actually get yourself in a place there. You're not ever, no creative organization's ever going to get there unless there's a lot of political goodwill, etc., behind it. So I think there's a tension there in a number of ways. The Creative Land Trust as a direct competition to artists and artists organizations, while also land and buildings also being a finite resource. So it's where you go and where are artists going and where do they want to be. And it's kind of our responsibility, well, ours at East Street, to kind of follow them there and support them in where they want to be and where they see best to fit. And in many ways, it's about getting there early. And that's hard.
I guess the conversation there is, about having some kind of a vehicle to protect, the buildings for artists and makers in the long term. And how that's achieved, whether that's through models like yours, which are really have been about building the arguments for and securing the capital funding through a variety of, in the past, European and national sources to acquire freeholds.
And it's been really interesting. That one, the Keighley one's really interesting because they began as a temporary space. Sort of 15,000 square foot is the space that we're now developing, but that was a temporary space that we ran. They came in as a group of artists to use the space, formed themselves into a group, organized themselves into becoming a charity, had a very good board of trustees, very well connected into the area, were able to tap into Towns Fund and Levelling Up funds, this is the other thing which I think is really important, is that I think we're pigeonholed as arts and artists and arts organisations into, well, it's just arts funding. The funding we got there is nothing to do with arts. It's about regeneration. It's about levelling up funds. There's nothing to do with it. But we are in just as good a position as any other sector to go into and attract that fund, and maybe better because the outputs can be more public. And I think that's what I was saying in the other response, is that there's possibly that actually you're also shutting down by going into the land trust. You're not animating through an organisation who goes in there. You're animating through a trust which doesn't have a vested interest.
Yeah.
And then bringing in yet another person to run the building who's may or may not have a vested interest. So it's about who's involved where and how.
Yeah, it's about who's involved, isn't it, and how it's run. And I'm sure creative land trusts can be vehicles which protect the long-term interests of creative organisations and create, a route through for those organisations to take affordable possession and have security of tenure in the long term. So it is now 28 minutes past 3. And I did say that we were going to finish by 3 o'clock, which doesn't quite look possible, but I do want to start drawing this to a close. So we're going to send out a summary of today's takeaways. There are some resources and toolkits which are specifically for would-be providers of creative workspace, which we'll be including, and you'll be invited to stay connected with Creative Workspace Network as it evolves and is being reshaped based on what people like you tell us they need. So I'm going to close this session now, only 3 minutes late, which is very good for us. Thank you again. Hope to continue the conversation. Thank you to all of the speakers from Hull, Middlesbrough, and Luton. Great of you to give us your time. And for those of you who've been tuned in, I hope it's been interesting or useful or both. Thank you. Have a good evening.